Welcome back to the program. I am excited today because my friend Cheryl Baird is joining for this podcast, and she is not only a really cool person, but also a really good leader and someone who thinks a lot about health, mental health at work, and the kinds of things that we need to be doing in order to maintain that. We talk a lot on this show about what it looks like to be a human at work and the fact that that doesn't change when you go to work. And so I asked Cheryl to come on this podcast to talk about some of her professional expertise in this space, but also some of her personal experience in this space. And I'm looking forward to both. So Cheryl, welcome.
Thank you so much, Stosh. I love Insubordinate, and I love hearing your voice and your thoughts on leadership. So it's a thrill to be here today.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit more about yourself, about your career journey, and in doing that, what makes you insubordinate?
Yes, great question. I started working as a therapist right out of college, and I knew it was something I wanted to do because my folks got divorced when I was 16, and my mom got me right to therapy when my dad left, and it was life-changing for me as a 16-year-old, and I remember sitting in that office thinking, "This is the kind of work that I want to do. I wanna help people heal." And so the journey through that was my husband and I got married out of college. We started having kids, and I would work in a counseling office, and then I would step back, have a baby, step back in, and really enjoy the work, but it was also taxing with young children. And when the position was offered to me at our church to work as the pastor of spiritual formation, I thought it was a really neat opportunity to use my skills in therapy and also to try to help the church become a place that felt safer and that
Mm,
felt more welcoming to those who maybe were marginalized and didn't feel like they could find a church home. So I stepped into being a pastor. I had been to seminary right after I graduated from college. So I got my master's in theology and got a master's in clinical psychology. I did both. And that really set me up well to work within a church setting, but also use my therapy skills. I have found that regarding the insubordinate question, I found that women who speak up, who ask for equal pay and equal treatment, whether it's in a church setting or in a therapy setting, can be put into what I would call a bitchy box simply by wanting to be treated the same as men. I've been in two specific settings now where my unwillingness to bend to authority, which I felt was unfair or even dangerous to women, has caused me to get that reputation of rebellious or insubordinate.
yeah. Yeah. So there's a ton there and a
Mhm.
ton of the reason why I wanted to bring you on this show.
Yeah.
But background and I guess in some ways full disclosure. So part of the reason why we know each other is because we went to the same church for a really long time and
Mhm.
then worked together in that context because you were on staff and I was leading the governing board.
Yes.
And people who've listened to this podcast have heard my journey and my story about that
Mhm.
space.
Mhm.
And so hopefully we'll get into some of that with your experience as well. But also for the record, since we're right up front about this podcast, me as a person, me as a leader, like my goal is to make it so that everybody who's capable of leading gets to lead and no qualifications to that, no caveats to that. So I fully support what did you call it? People getting put in the bitchy box?
Bitchy box.
Yeah, like I fully support the bitchy box, and the bitchy box should be the world,
Yeah.
right? Not a little corner of wherever people said you should be able to play. I think the bitchy box should be gigantic. I think we should all live in it.
Mhm.
And that's one of the reasons why this podcast is called Insubordinate. But it also is a very real thing. And I want to acknowledge that because it's been really painful for you, I know, but also for a lot of people and people who would listen to this podcast as well, that it's a lived experience that you get labeled and you get pushed aside and you don't get to do the things that you're best at and you don't get paid the same as somebody else who does them. I remember pretty vividly the conversations that I was having in some of those spaces
Mhm.
and when hearing about this is how Cheryl does the job that she does and she has permission to do it because of X or Y or Z. And I'm like, listen, Cheryl is more qualified than I am by a million miles. And you will listen to me because I'm sitting at this table
Mhm.
because I'm an elder, because I'm a governing board chair or whatever, right? But I have no claim to expertise or background or authority in this area, and she has all of that, and you're going to tell me like that was one of the things that just blew my mind.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
anyway, so I mean, I want to be upfront about that, and I want everybody to know that that's where we're at. But I want to follow up on something that you said, because you used the word safe a couple of times.
Mhm.
And so I wonder if you'd talk a little bit more about that. What constitutes safe? And as obviously people are thinking about the workplace, what can leaders do to be better at creating safe environments for people who come into those environments?
Yeah, great question, Stash. And I think I did learn a lot about safety by processing with you and others, but those that I found that had a high emotional intelligence and were able to step aside and listen to others. So I think the willingness to listen creates a safe space. I think men in power have to be committed to another way of doing things. Women and people who are not white have so much to teach this world. And yet, as we know, many of our organizations are run by men and white men. The experiences that women have, the experiences that people of color have are different. And the way they may view the world is different. And it takes a lot of humility to admit that we are better when we are together and that we grow and glean from diverse opinions. And I think that's the safety comes from a leader being willing to sit down and really hear what I would be saying and really care about what I would be saying. And I think that the safety comes from that person not just imposing their agenda upon me or upon the organization, but rather being willing to have their hands open and be willing to just to step aside even if needed. I just think there's no better example of great leadership right now in this safe space than President Joe Biden and what he has created. He showed us what leadership looks like. He wanted the people around him to feel safe enough to be able to speak up, and they did. He got out of the way, and he allowed a uniquely qualified and gifted vice president to step into that role. And I find that very inspiring. And I think when people are willing to step down and they're willing to listen, that creates safety.
So we talk a lot in this podcast about practical advice, right? So what are your thoughts on? So let's just say somebody's listening to this podcast and they're hearing this and they're saying, I'd like to be more of that kind of leader. I
Mhm.
recognize the need for that. It makes sense. It's good business. Let's be honest. But I also struggle with figuring out just the how to do that, or what does that look like? Because sometimes we get in, and I can say this from personal experience, right? I'm a upper middle class white guy, right? Sometimes the reality is we don't know what we don't know.
Mhm.
Or even when we do know what we don't know, we're like, okay, but what do I do about it?
Mhm.
And I want to be really careful about asking that question though, because I
Mhm.
think there is a space where we get a little lazy. And so when I say we, whoever the dominant people are, and I don't feel like it should be always on the woman who's a part of the executive team, for example,
Mhm.
to be educating all the men on how they should be treating women in a workplace, right? Like that's not what I'm talking about here. But to your point about being able to listen and step aside a little bit, what are some practical steps or advice you have for leaders who want to grow in that space?
Yeah. My current boss, I'm working at a counseling agency, and my current boss asks me questions about my work all the time.
Hmm.
When he asks a question, he's in a receptive posture of really wanting to hear me. And he's a ground up rather than a top down kind of leader. And he wants to hear my voice. He wants me to be the kind of therapist that works with my personality, not his. And he's not trying to get me into a certain space where he feels comfortable. He wants me to utilize my gifts and talents. And he will correct me for sure, which I need. He'll offer suggestions, which is very important. He's got so much more experience than I do. But I feel safe in the environment with him because he allows me to be me. And that makes me an effective therapist. And it causes the environment that I'm in this office, this new office setting, to feel very healthy, to feel very inviting, to feel very freeing. And I think it's why the agency is going so well. I think everyone is allowed to be the kind of therapist that works for their personality. We're not trying to fit into a mold of our boss. He's recognizing everyone brings different gifts and abilities to the table. And as we are able to utilize those, we're stronger and we're better.
Yeah. And again, this is something we say all the time on this podcast. It is about performance.
Mhm,
And it doesn't matter what kind of workplace we're talking about,
mhm,
right? Whether it's a therapy office or a
mhm,
Fortune 500 company or a second grade classroom,
mhm,
it's about performance. And
mhm,
you use the word effective a couple of times there.
mhm,
Obviously, I mean, we all know what effective therapy looks like in the sense that people are healing, they're growing toward wellness, they're getting better in some way and recognizing things and feeling actualized and having agency and all those kinds of good things.
mhm,
And they need help to get it. And people who are able to provide that help, like yourself and your colleagues, are effective because of some of the things that you're talking about. That's
mhm,
obviously a good thing. And you mentioned President Biden a couple of minutes ago. And regardless of what you think about politics or that particular leader or anything else, the reality is he had a choice.
mhm.
And
Yep.
there might very well have been a lot of pressure about that. And he
Mhm,
might have been very uncomfortable taking that decision. I don't know
mhm,
but that could very well be.
mhm,
And yet he decided, hey, what's best for the greatest number of people, at least in the interest of the Democratic Party in this country, is me not going ahead with this thing.
yes.
And obviously, regardless of where you sit on your opinion of him, that takes a measure of humility and that takes a posture of wanting things to be better for other people. And that you were making the same comment about your boss, that
Mhm,
this is a person who comes with a measure of receptivity
mhm,
and wants you to be more of who you are and let your personality shine through. But what's interesting to me when you say that is inevitably what's going to happen. And this is the part that we don't talk about when we say, yeah, show up with your strengths and all that sort of stuff,
mhm,
is that me giving you permission to do that, your boss giving you permission to do that, is going to once in a while rub him the wrong way.
mhm,
He's going to have to make adjustments to
mhm,
say, okay, if I'm going to make space for Cheryl or anybody else to operate the way they operate, that's going to mean I actually have to be less connected or involved or
mhm.
authoritative or whatever that is, and watch this thing play out in a way that I probably wouldn't have chosen. And it might just be because I wasn't aware of that was even a pathway potentially to go forward in.
Right?
But I'm actually going to have to watch this play out and not know the ending
Mhm,
because I'm not orchestrating it anymore.
mhm.
I'm creating space for that. And that can get really uncomfortable. But I wonder if you'd talk a little bit more about that experience, because obviously you've been in a bazillion of those, and I haven't, and a lot of the people who listen to this podcast haven't, that of having that space created, and then it creates that, oh, okay, now we've actually got to work something out. We've got to have conversation about the styles or the tension that it's created or the way forward.
Mhm. Yeah, I've been in 2 distinct spaces that fell apart for me, and
Mm,
the first was a parachurch organization maybe 20 years ago where I was the director of a girls' camp out in California, a girls' athletic camp, and then the other one was the church that you and I have referred to, which is where you and I met, and you were on the board and I was a staff member. And I have often felt as though my authority was questioned in those 2 spaces because they were fear-based in how
mm,
they were leading. And so they were, afraid that they couldn't trust me. They were afraid that their way was not going to rise to the top, and so because of that, I was in the way of their goal being accomplished. And that's the difference I see now in this non-Christian space I'm in, is that we're not operating out of fear, and how it just feels like it's upside down, right? It feels like it should have been the other way around. It feels very disorienting to have those experiences in Christian spaces. And it's so interesting to me that in both of those Christian environments I'm referring to, there was a patriarchal structure. And that
mm,
structure did not allow me to fully thrive in my work. And so as a pastor, I was told once by my boss that one of the things that was a negative about me was that the immature people were flocking to me. And that was so confusing to me because I felt like that's why we're here, right? We're here to take
mm.
care of those who maybe don't have as robust of a faith or who are asking questions. Those are the people that I am drawn to. And I there was a misunderstanding apparently of what ministry even was. And even being told then by that same person to stay in my lane. And I'm fairly certain that he never said those things to any of the men on staff. It was the
Mm.
women staying in their lane that was important. And in the parachurch space, when I walked away from that, I actually didn't walk away. I actually got fired from that. And the reason was because I wanted a girls' camp to be run by women and the boys' camp to be run by men, because that to me felt like that's a great division of labor. It's a great division of expectations, of safety. There's so many things that are woven into that. But I got fired essentially from a volunteer position for asking for equal treatment for women. And I was the director of a camp for girls. And my boss wanted it to be run by men, so it would be excellent, is what he said. And then I had a poor view of male leadership. And so there was that fear again of what would happen if a woman was in charge of something. And we need these guys who are wanting to be at the front, be at the center, be in the front of the brochure was more important to them than the camp being run by women. And we had such a great group of women who were running it. We had D1 coaches who were coaching, some of them national championship caliber coaches who came in to work with these girls. And the men felt so threatened because the women were doing so well with these girls that they wanted men back in the saddle. And their mission was more important than doing the right thing. And so in both of those cases, in the first case, they let me go. Second case, I had to resign because I felt like this is now we're operating out of fear. We're not looking at the qualities and characteristics of the people who are leading. We're leading out of fear.
I find myself incredulous, even though I know that happens all the time. I still find myself incredulous because I'm thinking to myself, okay, so you have a camp that is boys and girls. Why would you not have someone who's a woman running the girls' camp?
Exactly.
Like it just is, it seems like to me like a complete no-brainer.
hmm
That would make the most sense
hmm
for all of the reasons you stated, as well as I don't know how many others.
hmm
But it's interesting because you use the word fear several times there.
hmm
And one of the things that I would offer to the people who are listening to this episode is if you find yourself feeling a little uncomfortable about what you're hearing, that my advice to you would be give yourself a little bit of a check and say, okay, if these things came to pass, what am I afraid of?
hmm
What would be different about my day-to-day or my world if this was more true? Because if you're hearing this as degrading men or disrespecting men in leadership or whatever like that, I'm here to tell you, not so much,
hmm
because there's absolutely nothing wrong with a good leader who happens to be male leading in any space.
hmm
And there isn't anything wrong with a good leader who happens to be white and male and middle-aged or upper middle class or whatever. Any of those things, if they're doing it right, if they're doing it well, that's the caveat. And I think one of the things that's happened more regularly now than it ever has is the spotlight is getting put on people for their bad behavior or for their lack of inclusiveness. And I'm not the kind of person who says, I don't think inclusiveness is a goal. I want it to be about performance.
hmm
And so performance happens when we say, all right, if we're going to be strategic about what we do, that means we need to have ideas that we've rejected in favor of the ones that we chose. How are we going to come up with all of those ideas if we don't have a wide variety of perspectives? It's impossible.
Yeah.
And what that means is I do have to hold my opinion, my perspective, my experiences even a lot more loosely
Mhm.
in favor of this broader, and how do we make sure that we get the right decision made for the greatest number of people
Yeah.
in those spaces. And if you're listening to this podcast right now and you're feeling a little uncomfortable, again, my counsel to you is check what you're afraid of.
Mhm.
Check your experiences and say, okay, how many times have I made this decision because I feel like I'm the best qualified person to do it, or because that's just what I automatically do?
Mhm.
Because some of it is the unconscious that we have, that we carry around. We're just used to being the ones that get asked. We're used to being the ones that make the call. And so how do we push pause on some of those things that we're naturally inclined to do, or that we've been naturally expected to do so regularly that we just automatically do them now, and say, how can we do it a little bit differently? And what would that look like? And the whole thing about people feeling threatened or whatever they're feeling, I honestly, there's a big part of me just doesn't flat out doesn't understand it, to be honest. Because I'm like, look, if you're secure in your own leadership and you know what you're good at, then you can have all kinds of space for other people to be good at what they're good at too. But I want to turn over that coin because you've obviously had some really negative experiences. And I'm sorry that you've had those experiences because I've experienced you as a very good leader and someone who's very willing to be cooperative and collaborative and all of those things. And so what I wonder though is, what are the examples of positive collaborations that you've had?
Mm-hmm.
And what are some of maybe the characteristics or the questions or the practices that you've seen where the outcomes are good because of that mutual understanding and because of that creating space
Mm-hmm.
and because of safety and because of some of the things that you're talking
Mm-hmm.
about?
Yeah, we're part of a house church where one of our values is all of you is welcome here.
Mm,
And the thing that I love so much is that we actually mean it. I've been in spaces before where we have said that, but we don't really mean it. And that has always felt duplicitous to me and really off-putting. But being able to show up in that space just as I am has been such a healing experience for me. It's not just spoken about, but acted upon. And so I can lead if that's where I'm feeling like I want to plug in that particular week. I can step back and be quiet and I cannot go. I get to decide how I want to show up in that space and that I am welcome there. My questions are welcome, my concerns are welcome, my curiosity is welcome, and we don't have a template that we're trying to fill. We have people that we're trying to help thrive. And as we help each other thrive, it seems to really be working because we're listening to people. And like I referred to my current boss, he asks me questions about my work all the time. So he's that ground up rather than top down person. He
mm,
wants to hear my voice. He wants me to be the kind of therapist that works with my personality, not his. The correction that he gives me is very kind and it helps me to feel like I am being loved, I am being seen, and I am much more effective in my work because of that.
mm.
And I heard a great example of this in the Olympics when our US women soccer team won the gold and their coach, I think, has only been on the staff maybe 12 weeks or something, super quick as far as she just had to put this together very quickly and she did it. And when they were interviewing her after, everyone was just amazed that in the short amount of time she was able to do this. And she said, "We are leading with love. That is what these players needed to play well on the pitch.
Interesting.
They were hungry to be loved, not used." And she inherited a team who was beat up and tight, and she showed up as
Mm,
not a transactional leader, but a transformational leader. And
yeah.
she wanted her players to love what they do, love how they do it, and she trusts them, and they felt that, and look at what happened. They're a completely different team than they were in the World Cup. I think caring for our people well, loving them well, empowering them and encouraging them and watching them shine has such great rewards to it, and it feels so good inside. I think that's how I know I'm in the right space when it feels like that. This is not someone who's trying to be transactional. This is someone who's trying to be transformative and to help me grow and learn, but do it at my pace and do it with my skills, my abilities, my personality.
Yeah. So I love the soccer example. Thanks for that.
Yeah, I knew you'd
Um,
like it.
yeah, of course, I follow soccer pretty closely, obviously, but yeah, Emma Hayes is without conversation the best coach on the women's side in the world, and probably one of the top 5 or 10 in the world, regardless of gender. And so it's really interesting to see that transformation. And like you said, the word love, like we talk about a lot of different things, and we're comfortable using the word love in families and
Mhm.
sometimes with our close friends. We're almost never comfortable using it in a workplace. And it's an interesting conversation because it seems to me that is a fundamental human need, regardless of what application you're in.
Mhm.
And whatever the outpouring of that looks, and Yeah, let's be honest. It's easier in an athletic forum than it
Sure.
is in, and you and I obviously have pretty significant experiences in athletic forums. It's easier there
Mhm,
than it is in an office,
mhm,
a workplace,
sure.
right? But the how do we do that becomes really important.
Mhm,
So even if we're using a synonym for the word love, even if we're using care, if we're using understanding, if we're using empathy, whatever that is,
mhm.
what are some of the best ways for us to be able to create environments where that's at least more possible? I always use the word invitation
Mm,
because not everybody's going to take it.
mhm,
If we have an environment where we're actually doing a lot of those things, there are going to be some people that still don't sign on. And
mhm,
that's okay. We can't force people. Like
mhm,
acceptance can't be forced. But we have to create environments where it's possible. And
mhm.
so, what are some of the things? Obviously, you work as a mental health professional. What are some of the things that, practically speaking, we can do to make more of those kinds of invitations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's important to stop hiding what bothers me. And I think in unhealthy work situations, I think there's a expectation that you're going to check your pain at the door and you're going to come in and just do the work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what they found with that soccer team example is that it was the whole person. And I think maybe for a women's team in particular, that's so important. The whole person was considered, the whole person was noticed, the whole person was given room and space to thrive. And so I think stop not hiding what bothers me, but being willing to step into it with courage. And I think then we will see results organizationally and also personally. And I think it's so important to remember that the only two things we can actually control, and I talk to my clients about this all the time, the only two things we can actually control are our thoughts and our actions. So those are the two things we can do something about. So in a session, I'll be like, this is what we can do something about today. You can't control anyone else, and trying to will exhaust you. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the same for someone who's in leadership of an organization is trying to control the environment, trying to force an outcome is going to cause your people to be and people who are confined don't tend to do their best work. So when you choose to let go of what you can't control, you're going to reduce the amount of stress in your life. And you're going to reduce that by refusing to carry other people's problems. I'm going to focus on what I can control. Then I'm going to make the next best decision. And then if I'm a person of empathy, I can show up for others without carrying the issues which belong to them and not to me. So as I am growing up, so to speak, I'm 58 and I feel like I'm still growing up, but I feel like I'm really been learning that a lot about personally and also in my environments is that I can only control my thoughts and my actions.
Mm. That makes me think about the concept of micromanagement, because in some ways
Yeah.
that's what it is, trying to control things that really aren't in our control. But the reality is there are a lot of expectations put upon us in organizational settings where I don't think most people set out to be micromanagers, but I
Right.
think the expectations of the organization make it so that they feel responsible for those outcomes. And then therefore they start exhibiting micromanaging behaviors.
Mhm.
And so the question that I have for you, Cheryl, is how do we push back or create some boundaries or some space for ourselves when the expectations get so high that we feel like we need to start owning things that really ought not to belong to us, at least if we're going to be healthy?
Yes. Yeah. Great question. It makes me think of one of my favorite quotes from the iconic Maya Angelou, who said, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. And I have taken that to heart in many different settings. And in terms of mental health, for me, I have found that my mental health is going to improve when I am going to set boundaries that are going to protect me from people who don't have my best interests at heart.
Mm.
Believing them when they tell me who they are, rather than trying to change them, is a lesson that I learned in my last work setting for sure. And remembering that boundaries are not negotiable. And I teach this work with clients from a psychoeducation standpoint all the time on this, that boundaries are not negotiable. They are standards, they are limits, they are choices that I set for myself. And then others respond to them. But a healthy boundary can't be broken by someone else because I don't allow that to happen.
Mm.
And I think so many times we let that be squishy. And I think in past work settings, I have let that be too squishy. And I have tried to set a boundary and a limit because people have showed me, like the quote said, people showed me who they were. And I tried to set a limit, but then I allowed it to be crossed for the good of the organization. And that was a really difficult lesson to learn, that it would have been better and more effective had I held to that boundary and had I said, I'm unwilling to do this. I'm unwilling to participate in this. I'm unwilling to continue in this manner. And then he really held to that. And so I think that learning to set boundaries, learning to be self-protective and owning those boundaries in a way in which I believe them to be true and right. And I'm not offering them up to someone else and even my boss and saying, hey, how do you feel about this? But rather I'm saying, no, this is my limit. And there are times in an organization where one does have to do that. And being discerning about that is really important, obviously, because sometimes we have to do things in any job that we don't like. But I think that sense of I am, it is okay for me to protect myself. And it is okay for me to say no to something that I feel is wrong or unhealthy or unsafe.
So let me play devil's advocate for a second here and ask you
Mhm.
about, because you're asking people really to exhibit a pretty high level of courage and potentially even risk. Because if I have the
Mhm.
right kind of boundaries and I'm in the wrong kind of organization, then I stand to lose quite a bit up to and including my job if I take
Mhm.
those kinds of stands. And
Mhm.
now, just for the record, I would be the person who says, hey, look, ultimately, you're not going to be happy or healthy if you continue in that environment indefinitely. And so it
Right.
probably makes sense for you to be looking for another job anyway, proactively, right? Okay.
Right.
I'll say that out loud.
Mhm.
Having said that, though, tell us more about how we can navigate that in the meantime. Maybe I have a pretty high level of actualization and I'm pretty able to set those boundaries. And I know that there's going to cost me and I'm looking for another place to work that's going to be more healthy for me. But in the meantime, how do I operate in that kind of an environment, knowing that I still need to pay my bills? I still have people who depend on me and I don't want to
Mhm.
show up every day and feel awful at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. The first thing that comes to my mind, Stosh, when you ask that question is the importance of seeking to understand before we seek to be understood.
Covey.
And so it's stepping into an environment that may not feel exactly right. And may feel like boundaries, they're trying to cross boundaries. But I would say to a person who's in that setting, I would say, seek to understand what's going on. What's the undercurrent of the organization? What's the fear of the leader or the concern of the leader that's causing them to
Mm,
clamp down? Why am I having to set these boundaries? And if I can understand the why, of my boss or my organization, I can better navigate that, and I can withstand it for maybe a little bit longer.
mm,
And hope what I have found is that when I'm curious with people, when I have my hands open, I'm really listening, even to a boss, there's a relief that comes from that because so many of us don't listen to understand. We're listening to just reply. We're listening to just wait for our turn. And having that posture of, okay, I really want to know why he or she is feeling this fear. I want to know why they're coming at it from this place. I want to know what pressure they're experiencing, which will help me then to be able to respond better to their requests. And maybe their requests will make more sense.
mm.
In a church setting, it's money, right? It's always the money. So if the money dries up, we're going to be in trouble. If people stop giving, blah, blah, blah. That's always what drives it. Sometimes in organizations that drives it too. And so just recognizing, okay, my boss is under a lot of pressure because he or she is feeling the financial impact of these things. So
Yeah.
how can I come along and support without giving up who I am, without doing something that I feel to be dishonest or harmful? How can I respond to that felt need of that leader?
Yeah. I love that. That's really good counsel. And it makes me think about another thing we talk about a lot on this podcast is the both and not the either or, right? It's not all or
Mhm.
nothing. It's there's an understanding that can come from following the advice that you just gave that says, hey, you know what? This might be seasonal, not permanent.
Mhm.
Or I
Right.
might be able to create an environment where this person's concerns are alleviated because I'm able to do X or Y or Z, or I can align other people to this cause or reallocate some of
Mhm.
our effort or whatever and solve this person's
Mhm.
problem. And then therefore my problem is solved because now I'm not feeling this same level of pressure, whatever. And I don't want to make it sound like it's
Yep.
just an easy equation and we can all just solve it right away and easily. But I also
Mhm.
advocate pretty strongly for, if you're going to leave any kind of situation, whether that's a relationship, a job, anything, you have to be able to look at the
Mhm.
mirror and say, I did everything I could. And then
Yeah.
I said, all right, that's it. That's enough. And now obviously there are issues with if it's unsafe or et cetera, right?
Mhm.
Like you just leave, period. And you don't even have to
Mhm.
answer to anybody about that. Having said
Mhm.
that, though,
Mhm.
I think it's important to be able to say, I tried to, like you're saying, I tried to understand and I asked good
Mhm.
questions. And the word curious,
Mhm.
I think, is great. That's obviously a very, and I don't say this in a demeaning way, but that's a very therapy word.
Yes,
Getting
for sure.
curious
Uh-huh.
about someone else's perspective or curious about your feelings or whatever.
Yep.
But there's a reason why that
Mhm.
works. And there's a reason
Yep.
why good counselors, good therapists, good mentors, good leaders encourage us to be that way. And because
Mhm.
it is effective. And so I really like that counsel because I think there's too much reactionary behavior in some of these
Mhm.
spaces.
Exactly.
And I was reading a thread
Mhm.
the other day that I was actually just appalled by and incredulous about, because I was watching all of these people chiming in about their workplace and saying, here's my workplace asking me to work extra time or whatever and not being paid. And they were breaking it down to on a 5 minute increment. They're like, I'm not even going to work 5 minutes without being paid for 5 minutes. And I was like, how
Mhm.
many times do you check your text messages in a day? Do you expect to have
Yeah.
to clock out for that? Do you want
Yep.
the organization to start
Yep.
asking you how often you go to the bathroom or go take a smoke break or something and you don't get paid for that? If it's all going to be quid pro
Yep.
quo like that, then the world is going to be in
Mhm.
trouble fast. And you're going to be
Yeah.
unhappy fast because the equal and opposite reaction to that is basically going to be the ultimate micromanaging experience. And no one wants
Exactly.
that. So I
Mhm.
love the idea of curiosity and seeking to understand because it prevents us from taking that posture of, I just need to get my walls up. I just need to get my boundaries made and I need to be insulated so well that I'm not going to be affected, because as soon as we get to that place, then we get into the echo chamber of what we think and nobody else can inform that. And then we start doing this thing where, like I'm not even going to put up with somebody asking me for 5 minutes past my 4:30 departure time or whatever, even if that's in everybody's
Yep.
best interest and in the best interest of the organization, who, by the way, is still paying my salary and helping me pay my bills. So, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, it just gets crazy, right? It just gets crazy, and I don't understand. So, yeah, I
Mhm.
really love that counsel. What are some of the signs that we could be looking for that say, hey, here's your boundary is being crossed, or your mental health is being affected, or you
Mhm.
really need to think about changing your situation at work?
Yeah, I think really paying attention to the cues from our bodies is really important. One of the books I use all the time, it's a famous one, The Body Keeps the Score.
Mm,
And that's a lot about trauma reaction, how we hold things in our body. And I knew it was time for me to make a pretty big move at work when I could feel it in my body. I was bringing it home.
mm,
And it's interesting. One of the first times I spoke up, Stosh, what I was told was, "Why don't you write down what you do every 15 minutes?" And so it's so interesting you just brought that up because that's exactly what they asked me to do. And I remember thinking, I am not being heard. I am not being seen. I am not being understood. It is not about production. This is about the state of my heart when I walk in this building.
mm,
And they just couldn't go there. And so I think really listen to your body, and that's something obviously we do in therapy all the time. Where are you storing stuff up? And if you are coming home and you can feel your workplace in your body, that's one of the times when you know I have to do something different. Paying attention to sleep. How are you sleeping and why is that being disrupted by your workplace? Are you carrying stuff home and are you unable to let it go because it piled up so much during the day? You can't let it go, that's a really important sign. I often will counsel people who have stressful jobs that how are you using your time on the way to work and the way home from work?
Yeah.
And so many people are filling their minds with more information. One guy was saying, "Oh, I'm sports radio." And I go, "Yeah, but don't they fight back and forth on sports radio?" And what if you drove home with quiet and stillness? And what if you let your body rest and you let yourself come to a place where, okay, I feel ready to enter into my home environment. I'm not going to carry all the junk from the day with me. But if you can't recalibrate, even while you're driving home, excuse me, if you can't recalibrate, then this happens day after day. It's not just a bad day at work, but I can't seem to leave it behind. I can't seem to sleep. I can feel it in my body. Those are all really important signals to pay attention to. And
Mm.
that's what we say all the time about anxiety is that your body is saying to you, there's something not right here. And most of us, if we really tune in to our bodies and we're able to hear that voice saying something's not right, that's when it's time to make a change.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like the coaching to think about what you're doing with the commute time or the just before and
Mhm.
just after work time. I've used that many times. And I think it also links to our personalities. If we're the kinds of people who have active minds, then we have to think about what we
Mhm.
aim it at, because rumination
Mhm.
obviously is a really bad thing and increases
Yep.
stress levels and all that sort of stuff. So if we're just the whole way home grousing in our minds about what the day was like or all of the other things, then chances are probably pretty good that when we re-enter into the areas that we are probably going to say are most important to us, we might not necessarily show up in
Mhm.
ways that we're happy about. And that's one of the questions I've used in the past. To what extent are you happy with the person you are for the first 15 minutes when you walk in the door at home? And
Yes.
what are the things you need to do at work to make it so that you are happy with that person? And everybody else is
Mhm.
happy with
Mhm.
that person for that matter, right?
Mhm.
Because
Yes, exactly.
if we're dreading, the arrival of a significant other in our lives because work is affecting them in such a way as to make them very different than who we know them to be, then that's obviously another good sign that something needs to change here. So,
Exactly. Yeah,
yeah.
and I think back to Mister Rogers, right? One of my
Mm,
favorite shows when I was a little kid, and how intentional he was about the changing of his clothing when he
mm,
came in the door.
mm,
He would change his sweater, change his shoes. He had a whole process. And we were just as a little kid, I loved watching that. And I was intrigued every single time by watching him do it
yeah,
because he was shifting into a different space and he needed to show up differently. And he was leaving his work life behind and stepping into his home world. And
yeah.
I think that transition I think we miss it. And I think it's really
Yeah, that's so interesting because I don't think I really ever obviously I watched that show when I was a kid. Most people did, but I don't think I ever thought about that
Mhm.
aspect of it. It was just like this interesting little episode where he sits down and he's changing his shoes and he's putting on his sweater or whatever. And yet
Yeah.
we've
Uh-huh.
lost, I think, some of the formality and some of the ritual around that. So, what ideas do you have, or what
Mhm.
counsel do you have about the kinds of things? Obviously, the commute time could be one of them, like turning off everything and just driving home in silence, potentially. That's potentially one of them. But what are some of the ideas that you have or ways that you've counseled people to create some of those rituals, and what are they?
Yeah, I think it's really important to like going back to the listen to your body thing, right? So what do I need for this particular day? And some days it'll be important that you create more space between home and when you get to work. Like for me, I work from home and I think you work from home too. So there's a lot of work from home type things, but there's a lot of strategies that I have learned, which is like containing my work to this room that I'm in right
Mm,
now. And because I work via telehealth. And so my boss has helped me with some rituals in terms of who am I in this room? What is my role and my responsibility in this room? And then when I cross that threshold of the door and I go into the rest of my house, I'm not a therapist. I'm showing up as a person, as a wife, as a mom, as a friend. And making that transition intentional sometimes means I have to wait even 5, 10, 15 minutes before I walk into that other space when I'm done with a session to
mm,
recalibrate and to even to think about, okay, now what? What does out there require that's different from in here? Because I want to be focused in here. I want to be available. But I don't want to be a therapist out there. I want to bring my personality with me, but I don't want to bring the therapy part of me out into that room and the family, the people that I live with. So even just taking a little more time to transition between one thing to the other. I remember when our kids were little and I'd be driving home from work and my husband was here with them. I remember sometimes just having to drive a little slower, maybe
Mm,
stop at a park, give myself some journaling space to what happened in this day. And then when I show up for my people, I've unpacked it and put it in a place. I love journals. I love being able to close it. And I
mm.
think writing things down, containing things, and then putting it in that closed space, knowing I'm going to get back to it, but now is not the time when I have to deal with that, but I will get back to it eventually.
Yeah. I love what you said about your personality isn't going to change, but the application is. And
Mhm.
you said that
Yep.
in such a brilliant way. I've tried to express that in episodes in this podcast, and I don't think I've done it as cogently or as well as you just did, where in essence, we're not changing who we are, but we are going to change how we apply that
Mhm.
and what that looks like to the people in each of
Exactly.
those environments. And I think it's also
Mhm.
okay. And I want to encourage those of you who are listening to be able to name the fact that some of you have hard jobs and you're in hard
Mhm.
situations. And I think people like yourself,
Yep.
Cheryl, who are in a mental health profession, who are therapists, et cetera, that's a hard job. And that requires more of
Mhm.
those awareness points and those rituals and those transitions because, and it's not to say that's a better or whatever, if there's not a hierarchy to it, but the more stress we have, the more we are in contact with potential areas of difficulty or whatever it is, I think the more likely it is that it's going to be hard and the more important it is to have those rituals, those transitions that you're talking about. But I would even rewind and say,
Mhm.
have we even named the fact that, yeah, I have a hard job. And so therefore
Yeah.
I need to, whatever that need to is.
Yeah, I've been really learning the language, and my husband's been so helpful to me in this. As we have navigated it together, learning the language, even I'll just say to him sometimes, I just need a minute. When I am done with a session and I've decompressed, and then I go out into that room and he's generally out there and our son is generally out there as well. And sometimes I just they'll ask me a question and I'm realizing I'm not open for questions yet. I need to change my clothes. I need to, Mr. Rogers, I need to put on it and even though what I'm wearing could be very comfortable, I feel like I need to change into something different that's not what I've been working in.
Yeah.
And I need to show up differently. And sometimes I do that by just saying, I just need a minute. I can't quite do that yet. And sometimes they're in the middle of a conversation. So I'll go out and they'll ask me something in regards to what they're talking about. I'm behind on the conversation. I don't know what they've been talking about, and I can't come up with the answer yet.
Yeah.
And so rather than get angry about that, I've just learned to say, I just need a minute. And they get it. Now they get it. And it took us a little while to figure that out. But
Yeah.
that when I walk out there, I'm not just automatically available for conversation, but I have to own that and I have to ask for that.
Yeah. Is there anything different in your view going the other way? We've talked about leaving work and going into home for lack of more specific terms.
Mhm,
But what about the going from home to work part?
mhm.
Is there anything different or anything else that you'd say about that in terms of transitions or rituals or
Hmm.
things that we need to do?
Yeah, I think a lot about having a Teflon coating versus having a Velcro coating on me.
Mm,
And so if I show up into my workplace with a lot of the stuff from my personal life Velcroed to me and I'm carrying it around, that will show up in my sessions. And so I have to make that transition. It's like putting on work clothes, right? Rather than changing out of them. It's putting on my work clothes and showing up with more Teflon where the things of my world and my life, they shape who I am, they will shape my work. But if I have them in the very front of my brain, and I'm not using a good Teflon strategy to let them just slide off and stay off of me for that day, then I will show up as a way too, gosh, what's the best way to describe it? I'm a therapist that's got too much traffic in my head.
mm.
So there's a lot of noise, a lot of traffic, a lot of worrying about things. I have to be able to set those things aside. And that's a boundary I have to set for myself. I'm going to set those things aside. I can't be in a session thinking about our property taxes, for instance. I'm not going to fully invest in the session if I have a thing on the side that's personal that isn't right in the front. I have to be willing to, I have to capture it. And that's where journaling comes in so helpful for me. I have to capture it. I have to put it away, and I have to know I'm going to return to it, and I will return to it with the people that are invested in that particular issue. But I can't bring that into my work, because if I do, then I'm going to steer them in a direction that's not healthy for them. And it's not an accurate representation of what they're looking for, what they need that day.
Yeah. I think one of the lessons here is that it's going to affect us no matter what. Like the home to work or work to home, the
Hmm.
things that happen in those spaces are going to affect us no matter what. And we're going to carry them into those other spaces no matter
Hmm.
what. So what are the rituals? What
Hmm.
are the intentional behaviors, the things that we can do that help
Hmm.
us to minimize that, not only for our ourselves and our own health, but also for the benefit of others, especially if we're doing work like you're saying, where you're providing service to people who, let's just be honest, they need less of that traffic because they've got all the things that they're coming to for an hour that they need undivided attention to the extent that we're capable of doing that.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes,
And having enough time. Yeah. Having enough time and space to be able to show up without all those things strapped to my body is a really important thing for me. So I try and start my morning on work mornings. I try to really start my morning with an hour buffer between
mm,
outside life and home and then here in my office. And sometimes that's reading, sometimes that's prepping for clients, but it's making that shift from cleaning up the kitchen to coming in here. And I have just found that on a work day, that first hour really helps me to just then show up by the time my client starts, to show up with a way where I'm really focused on them and not so much on me.
yeah. So you've mentioned a couple times, and you said the word reading, it made me think of it. You've mentioned a couple times books, or you had a quote by Stephen Covey, one from Maya Angelou. What are some of the other
Mhm.
resources that you recommend a lot, or that people could look up and that generally speaking are going to be beneficial in some of the ways that we've been talking about?
Yeah. My favorite boundaries book is called The Book of Boundaries by Melissa Urban.
Mm,
And there's been lots of boundaries books out there, but that's the one that I have found to be the most helpful for me and for clients. Learning what they are, even just what are the mechanics of a boundary, setting it, holding it, not allowing other people to cross them is the hardest work of boundaries, and actually saying no, actually protect myself. So that's the Book of Boundaries by Urban. Another one I found really helpful recently is called Try Softer by Aundi Kolber. And it's a way to move out of anxiety and stress and survival mode into more of a thriving and healthy way of dealing with life. And I have found that to be tremendously helpful. One of the books that I've been using often with clients recently has been The Sneeches by Dr. Seuss.
mm,
And there's different stories within the Sneeches, but the one I love the most is there's one of this character's called the Zacks, and there's a north going Zacks and a south going Zacks, and they eventually run into each other. And because neither one will take a step the other direction, they starve to death just standing there in their spot because their paths collided and now they're unwilling. And all you'd have to do is take one step to the left or right and you could go along your way. But it's all about being open to change, recognizing our stubbornness, and
mm,
recognizing how, particularly in marital therapy that I do a lot of, stubbornness will sink you and you will starve to death if you're unwilling to accommodate the other person and unwilling to maybe make even a micro change. So that's been a really interesting one that I've been enjoying. A book about conflict that I've really been leaning into for a long time is called Thou Shalt Not Be a Jerk by
mm.
Eugene. Really good for these turbulent political times. It came out in 2016 and it felt very relevant in 2016 and it feels even more relevant today. But it's about empathy, it's about listening, it's about seeking to understand. And he talks about something called MADA, MADA, which is Make America Dinner Again. And that his desire is for people to sit around the table with people you disagree with
Mm,
and seek to understand and seek to be in that posture of, like we talked about before, seek to be in that posture of really getting it, like getting what the person is trying to say, not fighting with them, not discounting their reasons for holding the stance they hold, but rather seeking to understand, why do they hold the stances they hold? And don't we all have people in our lives right now who we disagree with for various reasons? And not his point is, let's not sacrifice the relationship. Let's work towards being able to better understand each other, and empathy and listening, such great qualities and so important. So that one's been really helpful for me. I pulled that out even just last night, and we were using it at our house church.
mm,
And so important to be in that pot, understanding where people are.
yeah. Yeah, great recommendations. I'll try to glean those from the text and put some of the links into the show notes so that people can go to Amazon or wherever and get a copy of those books if they're interested. I was wondering too, and I'm really happy that it came out. I'm listening to you throughout this conversation talking about the empathy, the understanding, the seeking to understand before you're being understood, those kinds of things. And I was waiting for that toughness part that I know exists there to shine through. And finally, I got it when you were talking about the Zacks and the "you will starve to death" kind of thing. If you're stubborn, you will
Yep.
starve to death.
Yep.
So there's
Yep.
that pointedness too, which I'm glad that folks are going to get to hear when they're listening. So
Mm,
I appreciate that part of it as well.
mm,
What else would you say about the journey you've taken? So you've said obviously some of the experiences that you outlined
mhm.
earlier in our conversation. As we're winding down our time, what else, if anything, do you want to say about the journey that you've taken as a leader, as a woman leader, as a leader in ministry, as a mental health professional, whatever hat you want to put on? Is there anything else that you want to add to that would help folks who are listening?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I know you relate to this, Dosh, that the about 18 months of really darkness after I left my last position at the church. And I needed that time. That time was painful and difficult. And I know it was for you as well, as you have shared on this podcast and in other settings. And I think one of the things I learned during those dark times was how important it is to be present to myself, just present to the work, but present to myself. And I thought a lot about butterflies in that time, and how monarch butterflies will not attempt to fly in the rain because the water will damage their wings. So they're going to rest and they're going to wait it out, and they're going to return back into the environment when the environment is safe for them.
Mm,
Self preservation, so important. And it's okay. It's okay to rest during the storms in your life. Take all the time you need, and you're going to fly again once the storm passes. But I think you and I both had that situation where we had to wait until the environment felt right. And I had to give myself that space, which I wasn't used to doing because the work was so urgent, right? It was always so urgent, always so important. We always had to do more and more. The stepping back, sometimes recalibrating, letting yourself not fly in the rain, I think is really crucial. And I have so appreciated learning that lesson. I use it more now on my days off than I used to. I
mm,
don't work on my days off anymore, and I used to do that all the time. And I think practicing that emotional regulation, slowing down in the face of urgency, it's counterintuitive to the work world, and yet it really is the best way for us to thrive, the best way for us to show up for ourselves, or show up for ourselves is going to allow us then to show up for others in a way that is so meaningful.
mm. Yeah. So last question I have for you. If I gave you a magic wand and you could wave it and give every leader in the world one thing, what would it be?
Empathy.
Because
Yeah, I think that's what was missing. That's what was missing from our last situation that you and I were in, is the empathy was missing. And I needed people to be able to understand why I was feeling the way I was feeling, not just that I was speaking up against something that I felt to be very dangerous and very painful, particularly to women. But I needed them to understand why I was speaking up, and why it mattered so much to me, and why one of the reasons they didn't get it was because they didn't feel that way. And so I would often say in these meetings, just because you haven't experienced this kind of thing before and it's not living within your body as it is within mine, doesn't mean that my stories or the women that I'm protecting, that their stories don't matter or are not important.
Mm,
Just because you haven't been there doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And I think empathy for your people, being able to, as a leader, show up and say, help me understand why you feel this way. Help me understand why you're carrying this in your body. And if we can do that, we're going to respond differently as leaders. We're going to have a different card in our deck than we had before, because that card is going to be, it's going to be, hey, I see you. I get it. I understand what's happening. I don't share that experience, but I'm going to validate your experience and I'm going to make decisions based on that, not based on what I think is the right thing. It's going to be based on how you're feeling and what you need. And that's what was missing.
yeah. Just because you didn't experience it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. That's a powerful statement. And I think you're absolutely right. I think leaders would do well to take that on board and recognize that even if you don't understand it, even if you don't agree with it, it doesn't matter. There's one thing I've
Mhm.
learned being married for a pretty long time. It doesn't matter whether I understand it or not. It doesn't matter whether I agree with it or not. What matters
Yep.
is I'm willing to create space for it and hear it and then act accordingly. And I don't ever have
Mhm.
to experience it. I don't ever have to understand it in order to be able to do that. I can create space for it and
Mhm.
I can
Yeah.
accommodate it and I can
Uh,
make room for it without ever fully understanding what it's like. And I think that there's a
mhm.
responsibility that we all have as humans, but a greater responsibility, perhaps even that we have as leaders, to your point, to be doing that kind of thing and creating those kinds of spaces. And so, my hope is that some of what folks are hearing in this podcast over the course of the last hour or so will enable them to do more of that or to be thinking more about that and what that looks like in their own environments. And so, I appreciate some of the practical advice and the accumulated wisdom of your experience. I have appreciated it
Mm.
over time in collaboration with you and as a friend, but it's also been valuable to me as a person who has benefited from those experiences and some of that wisdom that you bring and your willingness to share it with people. So thank you for all of that. And thank you for sharing today on the podcast as well.
Thank you so much, Stosh. I appreciate Insubordinate. I think you're hitting a nerve in people in the best of ways. And keep doing what you're doing.
I can hardly be otherwise. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And in the meantime, stay with the program.